Hello, and welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We meet here twice a month to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, and researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations here about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of it. I'm Stephanie Domet. I'm the managing editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful.
I remember going to the Philadelphia Zoo and watching a lion just pacing back and forth in this small cage, and how it evoked in me a sense of dread or anger or something. It's like, that poor thing, it's like it can't go anywhere. There's nothing of interest and so limiting.
That's Ed Adams. He's a psychologist and the founder of Men Mentoring Men, or M3, a not-for-profit organization that provides peer coaching for men. Ed's also the co-author of Reinventing Masculinity, the liberating power of compassion and connection. He wrote that alongside Ed Frauenheim, a journalist, researcher, and speaker who often focuses on masculinity and workplace culture, as well as the intersection between the two. So coming up on Real Mindful today, a conversation with Ed Adams and Edward Frauenheim about their book and the role mindfulness can play in liberating masculinity. But first, Mindful senior editor Kylee Ross dropped by to talk about our annual meditation challenge, Mindful30. Hi, Kylee.
Hi, Stephanie.
So the Mindful30, this is the 5th year for this challenge. Can you talk a little bit about what's involved and who's involved this year?
Definitely. So every year we bring together 8 teachers to guide us through 30 days of meditation, usually for the month of September. This year, the theme is resilience, which was pretty interesting given the year that we've had, and interesting to, go through what resilience means to all of these teachers. We have an amazing lineup. We have Toby Scruggs-Hussein, Rashid Hughes, founding editor Barry Boyce, Dr. Sarah King, Sharon Salzberg, Dr. Mark Burton, Dr. Shalini Mal-Biln, and Sarah Ivanhoe.
Wow, that's a star-studded lineup.
Yeah, it was just amazing to work with them.
And so what kinds of practices are they serving in this 30-day excursion?
So over the 30 days, they are serving practices that are kind of bite-sized. So 10 to 15 minutes, you're able to wake up and do this practice just to go through the entire month. And the practices vary. We have mindful movement, we have practices, breath awareness practices, all kinds of practices.
And now we're a little bit into the month of September, but I could start this anytime and receive it every day for 30 days. Is that right?
You can sign up any day throughout the month of September and start as if it's day one.
What do I need to be able to embark on this?
You need very little. You need a few minutes, really. You can sit down wherever you are, you can download the practice, take it with you. So I would say, I guess all you need is an internet connection.
Amazing. I have that. Well, thanks so much for dropping by and talking about this with us.
Thank you, Stephanie.
That's Kylee Ross, a senior editor here at Mindful and mindful.org. You can find out more about Mindful30 at mindful.org. We'll also pop a direct link into the show notes for you. Now, in the October issue of the magazine, mindful coach Chris Perraro writes about a subject close to his heart, how mindfulness can allow men to show up as their full selves. Here's a little bit from the beginning of his article. Chris writes, "Once in a while, during a typical hectic day in our household, my wife will turn to me wearing a pretend astonished smile and say, 'Chris, did you know that we have 3 boys?' Although it seems like she's just playfully stating the obvious, I hear her words like the ringing of a generations-old mission bell, a reminder of what's most important to me. Each time, I'm struck by the responsibility of raising our boys in an era when masculinity, in the way it's long been defined, is being called to expand. Now, if you haven't had a chance to read Chris's essay yet, I highly recommend it. I will link to it in our show notes, or you can find it in the October issue of Mindful magazine. You'll also find, in both those places, an excerpt of a conversation our senior editor Amber Tucker had with the aforementioned Eds, Ed Adams and Ed Frauenheim, also known in this conversation as Ed A and Ed F, about their book Reinventing Masculinity. Ed A's dogs were in the room playing, so you will hear the odd squeal of a squeaky toy in the recording of this conversation. And Amber started off by asking Ed Adams how they arrived at the idea of confined masculinity.
So the term toxic masculinity was just a common phrase that was being used in the culture. And both Ed and I early on decided we really don't like that term because it seems to implicate all men and shame men for being men. And the issue isn't toxic masculinity. The issue was how our idea of what it means to be a man was so limited. And so that limitation, the word that describes that is confined. Sort of that image of, I remember going to the Philadelphia Zoo and watching a lion just pacing back and forth in this small cage, and how it evoked in me a sense of dread or anger or something. It's like a poor thing, it's like it can't go anywhere. There's nothing of interest, and so limiting. And so we focused on confined and mentioned toxic, I think once or twice in reference to popular culture in the book, because we wanted to stay away from that particular terminology. And so that's where that's how it originated, and then we began to describe how it's confining. First of all, what beliefs has the social research literature demonstrated has typically confined men in the past and in the present, and frankly, if we don't change it, we're going to have a rather bleak future.
The one other thing I would say about the confined term that I really liked, it's sort of like at the root of what can be toxic behaviors, you could say. That when men are in that cage, like Ed talked about, they are in trouble. A lot of bad, sort of unhealthy behaviors or attitudes develop. It also captures this way in which we think we're so separate from each other in Western culture, especially. I think this idea that we have to be a self-made man, we're an island or a rock. So there's a lot about the term that really grabbed us once we kind of started playing around with it. We wanted to sort of see that in what was the root of it, and how can we describe this masculinity problem in a more neutral way that could be accessible and appreciated by people, especially men.
The idea of confined also allowed us to appreciate the traditional roles that men have played, like protector and provider. We're trying to underscore that those have enormous value, but that they have been too confined, too limiting, so that most men perceive protecting, as we mentioned in the book, it's like, I'll protect my family. I have a .357 Magnum right next to the bed, and God forbid somebody enters this house, so I could protect my family. Provide is typically looked at as having an economic fluidness enough to provide food and shelter. And there's nothing inherently that we're saying that there's enormous value in that. I have two dogs and they're playing with each other. I apologize. But providing is providing emotional warmth. Providing is providing availability, being present with people you love, and it's providing is taking care of your community and the larger earth. Protecting has something to do with being able to protect yourself and your immediate family from emotional distress or traumas. Again, it's being present, it's being available, and being playful too with people. So what our goal was to take those traditional roles and say, why are they perceived so small? Let's make it big. Let's let it rip.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting. And I noticed that you talk about not only those traditional male roles as kind of expanding them or turning the classic conception on their heads, but also some emotional qualities like the chapter where you talk about compassion. I thought was really intriguing. That there are kind of ways that you could say are more feminine and ways that are more masculine to express compassion, but they're both compassion. Would you be able to say a little more about that?
Well, see, our perception is that compassion requires enormous guts and courage because it forces you to actually witness and experience the suffering within yourself or others. I'm old enough to have lived through the Vietnam era, and every night on TV, I was young, but you would the reporters were on the front lines, so you saw Vietnamese as well as American soldiers get shot or lying there bleeding and getting blood, and you would hear the bombs and so on, and what it did was evoked a great deal of compassion by witnessing that in the American public, which helped end that war. But if you look at something like the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, what we were shown were images of computer games. A target was focused on, and then you'd see a puff. And you didn't see the people who were crying and the people who were bleeding, and so it created an emotional distance from the suffering, and that was intentional because the government learned from the Vietnam War that if you show what's actually going on, it's going to change the complexion of the public's opinion. So being compassionate is a truly courageous act because it's no longer avoiding the realities of life, and so we see it as something that takes a great deal of guts and courage to actually be a compassionate person.
Can I just add a bit to that, Ed?
Yeah.
So, I think what Ed was, sparking for me is this idea that it is manly. You could say that this courage piece that we've often identified as men's traits, or a manly trait is needed for this work. And to your point earlier, Amber, about the sort of feminine, masculine expressions of compassion, I think what we're getting at ultimately is this notion of this is a human trait. And it's men's birthright. It's part of being primates. It's really wired into us. Men have expressed it in more implicit ways, and we're calling on men to identify it and proudly talk about it explicitly now. And that's really, from my perspective of studying the workplace, it's needed to be emotionally intelligent, emotionally vulnerable, to create psychological safety, to succeed in work today. And I think, it helps men live a fuller life, a bigger life, to Ed's reference earlier, when we can see compassion as ours as human beings.
Yeah, wow. There's so much in all of that. What I think of right away is I know F, you have done, or Ed F, you have done.
You can just call me F.
Oh no. I know you've done work formerly, kind of in the evolving workplace space, and I'm curious how you see these new, more expansive or less limited masculine traits kind of helping to transform workplaces and make them more equitable, more sustainable. Any of those
Sure.
things we're kind of looking for now.
Yeah, I love that question, Emma. I think, to bring it back to the mindfulness piece that your magazine is about, and that maybe the article is about, is that when men are willing to be mindful, when they're willing to pause, and be a bit more about presence as opposed to action, that builds self-awareness. And that self-awareness is vital today to recognize privilege and the ways in which the workplace has not been equitable for all employees, all people there. And to start realizing, well, we maybe need to take some steps to distribute power more equitably, to make it clear that other people can achieve promotions in more fair ways and really look at bias. So that's a piece of it. And so is what we were just talking about with the willingness to be compassionate and vulnerable and emotionally intelligent, because that's where we're realizing that workplaces need to be successful. It's proven in data, like from Amy Edmondson's work at Harvard on psychological safety. The COVID pandemic has proved it dramatically more powerfully, with everyone realizing it's okay not to be okay. We're all kind of wrestling with emotional well-being when we're stuck in our houses for a month, for a year, practically. So I think, as we put in the book, and I got to give a nod to Ed's wife, Marilee Adams, like she helped us, use this phrase: soft skills are success skills today. And these soft skills are really what this newer liberating masculinity is incorporating into the male ethos. Things like compassion, things like connectivity, things like vulnerability, things like mindfulness, of really letting yourself become more mindful, aware of what you're feeling and who you are in the world.
I would love to hear, Ed A, if you have any thoughts on about the psychological struggles that we're facing. And as a psychologist, it's clear how maybe male people in particular are having certain kinds of struggles with, the stay at home and the kind of loss of control, that we've all had to face and process in the last year. Do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, one thought is that it's that the impact of COVID and all of its implications have been relatively gender-free. It's like both sides are suffering. It's like both are making compromises. Both are improvising in ways that we haven't had to improvise before. We're parenting in ways that we haven't had to parent before, or being in relationship with each other. But one of the things that I noticed clinically is that with people being in such close proximity to each other for such extended periods of time, it's putting a strain on emotional skills. So those who are reasonably well equipped to have good, deeper conversations once in a while, or to face life issues, or to talk about what they need or want, are faring better than those who are with each other and either afraid to talk about those things, or get angry when they talk about those things, or feel blamed, or feel uncomfortable in that territory. And so generally speaking, women have had more tolerance for emotional talk and emotional interaction. It's not that men are incapable of that. It's just that they haven't been in the environment. we talk a lot about men mentoring men in the book, or the men's organization, M3, which clearly demonstrates that men are hungry for and eager for and quite capable of going very deep and emotional, and being very vulnerable with each other. But they have to learn it. Typically with men haven't had that experience within their families, and particularly with their fathers. And Robert Bly, the poet, said, when a group of men get together, can some form of violence be far behind? And that means not just the potential for physical violence, but for shaming or being put down and so on. But when men find themselves in a safe environment, and become convinced that it's safe, they can really let it rip, because they want to go there. They're capable of that. It's not like they have some kind of brain matter that's missing. It's just the opportunities have been missing. I had in M3 a gay couple said, "Who would have ever thought that our best friends are?" They're part of M3. They once said, "Who would have ever thought? We would have never thought that our best friends are straight." Another man who's Jewish and grew up afraid of non-Jews for all the obvious reasons, once said, I can't believe that I finally feel safe in the company of men who aren't Jewish. And so there's a lot of let go that can occur when men feel safe, and they can go very playful, sort of what I refer to as living on the horizontal plane, but they could also go profoundly vertical and spiritual, in a spirit kind of way, and encourage each other to be more mindful of themselves and of others, and of what they feel and what they need and what they want. Men have come out in M3. Men have made career changes. Men have made marital changes, gotten married, decided to have children, or decided that it's okay not to. And they discuss these things with each other, and by doing so, have the advantage of the wisdom of a whole lot of men they feel safe with to think things through.
Can I add, I love that all this story and these examples from M3 and Amber, I've been completely convinced by what he's saying, having met these guys. Like, they're just guys, and yet they're so deep. That's the point about the vertical development. I wanted to make one little caveat about what Ed said at the beginning about the gender neutral, relatively gender equal experience of the pandemic. And this is something that I've seen from the workplace, is that there have been more burdens put on women as caregivers during this time. And Ed, maybe this is not something you've seen, but there's a lot more women who have left the workplace than men, for example. But I do think your point more generally is true about, the emotional taxation of this time certainly has affected both sides. I just wanted to make sure we let you know, Amber, we're aware of that piece of caregiving falling back on women, especially.
Good point. Yeah, definitely. There are certainly there's certainly been give and take on both sides, I would say, but yeah, of different weights. I really appreciate it, as you were gesturing there too, Ed. In the book that you mentioned, reflection and mindful practices were some of the things that helped you to redefine traits like emotional sensitivity, exuberance, and camaraderie as being worthy, and that those have improved your lives as a result. So
you're talking about Ed F then, right? I think
yes.
You said Ed A. Got it.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I know Ed does reflection stuff too, but that was, I think, talking about me in particular.
I think, yeah, you're right. I would love to hear both your perspectives on this. But I'm curious what kinds of mindful mindfulness practices or books or teachers or other kinds of meditation you found most helpful yourselves, and maybe what kinds you may have done with other men as well, if that's applicable.
Well, I deeply appreciate the work of Ellen Langer and the idea of most people associate mindfulness with meditation. You know, somehow it seems connected, and it's not untrue, but her way of looking at things, that it is paying attention to things that are different or things that are unique, or to pay attention to be other than mindless. You know, she talks a lot about mindlessness and just going through life in a rote kind of way. Ironically, I gave blood about 2 weeks ago, and with the Red Cross, and make a long story short, I was watching the way they were interacting with me and with other people donating. And then the woman stabbed me twice, couldn't get into a vein. And then she put something in her computer that she looked at me and she said, "You're done." I said, "I haven't given blood." She said, "I put the wrong code in the computer." And that was the only explanation I got. So I was a little ticked off, because that was about 2.5 hours of my time to come and go. So I wrote the president of the Red Cross, and I said, here's what happened. And if this continues to happen, people are going to be discouraged. I have gotten 2 profoundly important responses from 2 different people from the Red Cross. And I was just composing one about a response to the man who wanted to know what happened. And I was talking about the need for people who are acting compassionately to be validated, to be seen as what they're doing is important, and making a contribution, which they already know, but I think I was suggesting that maybe they ought to pay more attention in their training on this, you know. And so it has practical application in everyday life, because some people could give blood, and if they don't feel connected with, they're not going to go back. They're not going to do it again, or they'll. And so mindfulness is necessary with the staff to be able to be that everybody is unique, and to see each person as an individual, and to be able to respond to people in their sense of humor or their anxieties or whatever they're presenting. So I was trying to make an example of something, how that mindfulness is applied in everyday life.
If I could
It's not
build on
just
that,
meditation.
Yeah. Can I build on that, Amber, a little bit? Or,
Please, yes.
yeah, I think what I love what you're saying with that example is the common connection between mindfulness and what we talk in the book about is consciousness. Sort of how aware are you of how your behavior affects others, how you are how you're showing up in the world. You know, we really are calling for men to develop a much grander global consciousness that I think is about, our place here and our role here. We're not the most important person in the room, which we often think we are. And I think mindfulness can help us get to that self-awareness, that situational self-awareness is a term I've heard recently. To go back to your original question about the practices, Amber, for me, as I mentioned in the book, like yoga has been a major one for me that has included a mindfulness and a spirituality element to that practice. A meditation practice I picked up from a psychiatrist I saw for a time about anxiety issues, and that's been very helpful to me. And I would say that the workplace is becoming a more mindful place. especially during this pandemic, where we're now leaders and organizations and everyday employees are realizing we need to do things like check-ins and see how we're doing, being mindful of each other in that kind of more layperson term, but also things like breathing exercises and mini meditations to start meetings. So I'm hopeful that we are, all of us, realizing the power of mindfulness to really build better workplaces, better personal satisfaction, and ultimately a better world.
Yeah, one of my art mentors, his name is Alok, A-L-O-K. He's a Zen Buddhist artist, and I took from him that there are four things that are things that stick in my mind, and I preach in one way or the other with the people that I treat, and that is to be present, to be available, to be playful, and to be not knowing. I just love those four things, and to be present, available, playful, and not knowing. I try to use those, not even in those words, but to in times of stress and times of COVID and so on, how can we become more present, more available, more playful? And by not knowing means more of an open mind, not prejudging, being mindful rather than mindless,
Yeah, letting that curiosity kind of come up and naturally express itself. Is that kind of the idea?
Yep.
Yeah.
I always thought that Ed didn't know what he was talking about. Now I understand it's your philosophy, Ed. Trying to be playful here and present and available.
I really liked where you talked about the 5 C's at one point: curiosity, courage, compassion, connection, and commitment, and kind of what the interplay of those is, and how they all kind of mutually support each other. And I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit more about those qualities, anything that seems, particularly relevant to sort of a mindfulness discussion. Like for me, like I read those and I was like, oh, those are all qualities that we try our best to elevate in our work, and that we really see being elevated by the leaders that we work with. So kind of a little bit more about those from the perspective of expanding masculinity.
Go ahead, Ed, you could start.
Sure. I thank you for seeing those connections, Amber. And I think it's interesting that we did those 5 C's, and I started doing some workshops about reinventing masculinity at work in particular. And I've already added a 6th C, which is contemplation, which is this, explicitly calling out mindfulness, because Ed and I, in our 5 C's, we talked about, especially under the commitment one, maybe, that this is part of how you're going to make progress and stick with it. This journey toward liberating masculinity is through a contemplative practice. And I feel really strong, and I think Ed does too, that this is really important part of how men are going to advance, to make space for even if it's there's multiple ways of doing it, like I think it's getting at, like journaling, meditation, yoga, other kinds of spiritual practices or prayer. But I think it's something that men have poo-pooed. We've been so much about doing and achieving, but just the being and the paying attention to the journey is something that we have not acknowledged enough. And so I think calling that out, whether it's the commitment C or adding one, is really important. And I think we're seeing more and more men embrace these things, which I'm really hopeful about. Ed, would you add to that?
Yeah. The curiosity part is has something to do with the not knowing I was talking about before. It's like wondering. I love that word, to wonder. To wonder what you're thinking right now, Amber. I wonder what Ed's thinking right now. I wonder what what my wife may need from me a little bit later. It's like it's a state of mind that keeps you emotionally intelligent in many ways. It's the theory of mind idea that you stay curious about who's showing up right now, like what man is needed right now. And it might be the tender me, it might be the forceful me, it might be the playful me. Who's needed, that requires the curiosity part, and then to act on it, to actually takes the courage to step out, very often out of one's more mindless role of just rote behavior, and to be more have the courage to deliver the goods, to deliver what's needed from the man who is needed in that moment. And of course, the idea of one of the major thrusts of the book is, as Ed mentioned before, is to allow men to see that compassion it's built into the equipment. It's we are all born with the capacity and the desire for compassion, but for men to see it as manly, for men to see it not disconnected from manliness, and that I dream of the day when qualities of masculinity are seen to include compassion as manly. And then the notion of connection is what we're trying to do there is expand that we're maybe the better term is interconnected, how vitally reliant we are upon each other. And then the last one being commitment to change, to use these awarenesses, to use this mindfulness in a way that is to make a commitment to actually act with curiosity and courage and compassion and connection in a variety of different ways and in all of our settings that we find ourselves.
I love what you said about the interconnectedness, Ed, and that just sparked for me, we talk in the book about seeing ourselves as connected to the earth, and that men have for thousands of years really seen ourselves as masters of the earth or controllers of the earth. And I think there's a real opportunity for mindfulness practices that include natural settings or reflecting on nature, which you often, there's growing, like forest bathing is taking off during the pandemic, this idea of really, paying attention to the plants living around us, and trees. My son wants to study redwood trees. That is a real opportunity, I think, and a growing appreciation of our connection to nature, not just our separateness again from it, but our interdependence, interconnection, as I'd use the term, and the need to expand our consciousness by reflecting that we're part of this system. We're not like the boss of it, or about trying to wrestle it to the ground, but to actually appreciate we're connected to the ground.
That's so powerful, and I really appreciated, how you did talk in the book about, this is not just an issue of human society and well-being. It's really the future of the planet. It's our future to either continue polluting and subjugating the planet in the way that we have been, especially as Western countries, and to redefine that relationship, which is especially interesting, of course, because nature has so often been gendered as female. So there's that resonance for me too. And I would love to shift a little bit to talking about maybe how men might be able to bring, to start using that interconnectedness and all of these skills, really these soft skills, to family life. We've talked a little bit about the workplace, and in this feature, the author Chris Peraro, he's talking about this kind of incident he had with his family, and where his son was, they were riding bikes, and his son is struggling to ride. His legs are freezing up, and Chris catches himself when he's about to just shut down his son's vulnerability, and his mindfulness practice lets him notice, oh, I'm rejecting his vulnerability, I'm denying it, and instead I'm going to stop and get curious and help him solve this issue, right? So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, or what's worked in your families, or what you've seen work for other people.
Yeah. Ironically, I had a session this morning with a man who is doing very well financially. He was a military officer, and he has 5 children, one of which is severely disabled, and he had that child very early on in his life. So he stepped out of his being a son to a responsible father of a disabled child. And so he found a way to cope with that by being pretty linear. We got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, and kept his kids and his now wives sort of in a regimen. And he came to therapy having read the book, and he said, "I this isn't working for me." And he's really having the courage to make changes, and they're dramatic changes. For example, I told Ed about this. He would have a discussion with his wife about something important, but he'd do it in his office where he was behind his desk and she was in front of his desk. So it was more like a business meeting then. And he said, once we talked, they needed to deal with some issue. And he said, I invited my wife in. I sat in front of my desk. I put a chair so that I could face her. And I took her hand and I assured her that what we're about to talk about is in no way about his unwavering love for her. And so he was using that language. And she was blown away, and sort of they had this conversation, and she said, "What's that thing on your wrist?" He said, "I put this here," he said, "because I'm never going to take it off, because every time you look at it, I want you to know how much I love you. And every time I look at it, I want to remember how much I love you and owe to you." And to this day, when we have sessions, I keep looking to make sure he has it on, and he always does. And with his children, he said to me this morning, he said, I sat my 2 daughters down, and I told them that I'm no longer going to be tracking their progress as if it's like a flight. He said, but I'm going to pay a lot of attention to what you guys need and want and what you're experiencing. So he's shifting from being the director to being an affectionate, warm human being. And he's thrilled with himself because he's getting paid off enormously, you know. One thing he said is that I think I'm changing from, oh God, Dad's home, to, oh good, Dad's home.
I love that. Can I share another piece of that puzzle? Yeah, Ed has such great stories, Amber, from his patients and from the M3 community. You could hear many more. Maybe you do want to hear some more. I just was going to share one that I just experienced in my parenting the other day that I think connects both with the the liberating masculinity we're trying to develop, but also to your point about the triggers and the mindfulness. Like, it reminds me of the story of the guy on the bike. Your author, Chris. I was picking my daughter up from her soccer tryouts, and it was unclear exactly where they were trying out. I never parked at this soccer field before, so I wandered onto the soccer field trying to see my daughter Skyla, and she was livid at me because I was like the embarrassing dad who didn't know where to pick her up. She's 16, and she's like, I hate you so much for doing this. Why can't you be like the other dads? And so I was triggered by that. I'm like, how could you get mad at me? I'm here picking you up and like looking out to, safely guide you home. But this is part of my practice of like recognizing that anger rising in me and like taking a breath and kind of stepping away. And the two of us walked kind of separately, the equivalent of several blocks back to our car. And I think I was able to make space for her feeling, and be more empathetic. I'm not sure you'd call it vulnerability on her part, but certainly emotional reaction. And, I'm not sure I would have done that a couple of years ago, before we wrote this book, to really be aware of and use those practices of reflection and pausing, noticing emotional reactions, and then sort of mastering them, or at least making space for a more productive response.
It's amazing. Oh, go ahead. A?
No. I was just marveling at what Ed just said. So.
And I can add that even a loving response, not just productive, but like caring and loving. I would add that too.
Yeah, that's such a powerful internal shift too, and I can definitely relate in that, especially after spending over a year inside with my partner. You relate to your family members in very kind of automated ways sometimes, and sometimes it's noticing those habits that is the even trickier part than, or to me at least, than noticing them at work or with other relationships. Yeah, this has been a fantastic 50 minutes, and I could just keep asking you questions for several more hours, but I do want to let you both go and get on with your days in the next 5 minutes. But I would just like to ask, is there anything that you would have liked to bring up during this chat that I didn't mention?
What a great question, Amber. As a journalist person myself, that's I always try to end things. So thank you for that question. There is so much that's promising about mindfulness helping men go from anger to peace, that we are so inclined and taught that anger is okay for us. And it's such a harmful force in the world. And if we can move more toward a peaceful, loving responses to when we are hurt or sad, I think that would be good for the world. And mindfulness is a key way for us to do that.
Yeah. In Division 51 of the American Psychological Association, there's a lot of discussion within the division about how to respond to all of the nightmarish things that are happening. And my own perspective of that is the way to respond isn't from, say, shooting to shooting or sexual abuse to sexual abuse, but to give a louder voice to men who aren't doing that, to give a louder voice to men who abhor that, to give a louder voice to men who are against that, but give them a forum to express that, so that we could. I use the example of the movie Casablanca when the Germans the Nazis started to sing their anthem, and Rick nodded his head for the orchestra to play the French anthem. And so many people chimed in on the French anthem that the Germans shut down. And that's the metaphor that I'm using, is like, let's give greater voice to all these men who want to live in peace and abhor violence and want to change towards liberating masculinity. There's very little out there for them to have a forum. So if your magazine contributes to that, that's an enormous contribution. So thank you.
Absolutely. Those are such beautiful statements to end on. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time today.
You're welcome.
For all of your work.
Thank you so much, Amber.
And thank you.
Mindful Senior Editor Amber Tucker in conversation with Ed Frauenheim and Ed Adams, authors of Reinventing Masculinity. What a conversation. So much to think about in what the Eds are saying, and we would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. You can write to us at yourwords@mindful.org. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode of Real Mindful, perhaps you would leave us a review. You can do that on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcasts. You can do that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or, well, wherever you're listening from. Your review helps other listeners decide whether Real Mindful is right for them. If you're looking for a way to work with your own feelings and reactions to confined masculinity, that conversation about masculinity, or anything else that may be an issue in your own life, you might enjoy our weekly practice podcast, 12-Minute Meditation. Each week we offer a new guided practice backed by neuroscientific research that reveals that 12 minutes of meditation a day can be enough to yield benefits like increased focus, clarity, calm, and compassion. And you can find 12-Minute Meditation at mindful.org and wherever fine podcasts are found. Try it out, and then let us know what you think. We'll return with another episode of Real Mindful in 2 weeks. Until then, keep it playful, friend.